Hi everyone. Thank you for joining in for this for our monthly webinars. I think I'm just going to start with a brief introduction about ERA, hand it over to, and then after that, hand it over to Vijay to take the talk for to continue on this to start the webinar. Sorry about that. So, just a little bit about ERA and what we do. We are the Ecological Restoration Alliance. We're trying to build a community around restoration and gather people who want to work in this space to come together and provide a forum of sorts. Right. So the idea of the alliance is: can we start building connections between members? Can we use this as an opportunity to learn from each other and even curate and build a knowledge resource base that can be used for the common good, especially for building out the restoration movement, right? So one of the things that we started doing, we started last year, was these monthly webinars. And in these monthly webinars, we invite people to talk about their projects. We ask people to share tools and approaches or any other aspects that you really feel uh, can be beneficial towards restoration. So if, in case you have any ideas, please reach out to us. Um, and now I think I would like to introduce the topic Sounds of Restoration, which Vijay Ramesh would be talking about. And we use this opportunity to learn from Vijay, who is an avian ecologist with Cornell, on bioacoustics and what they tell us about life in different kinds of ecosystems. So Vijay is an avian ecologist. He studies the role of climate and habitat in structuring bird communities. Um, of the Western Ghats, and he also uses an interdisciplinary approach that borrows both from bioacoustics, community science, historical ecology. And his research is focused on understanding how the environment shapes the ecology and behavior of the tropical montane birds. Specifically, he studies the role of climate and habitat in structuring these bird communities of the Western Ghats biodiversity hotspot. So I think now I'll hand it over to Vijay to take this forward and share with us about his work.
Thanks, Arjun. Let me just quickly share my screen. I think you need to give me permissions.
Oops, sorry. I'm going to just stop sharing and I'll hand it over to you, maybe.
Okay.
Can you share your screen now, or is it still not letting you?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it should be visible now. Yeah.
Sorry, before we start, just a quick note. Please, if you can put your questions in the chat box, we'll take them up towards the end. In case you're joining on YouTube, then please still put your questions in the chat box and we'll look at it there and kind of consolidate all of them here. Right. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Arjun. Thanks so much for inviting me to talk about this research that I'm really passionate about. And thanks to everyone who's tuned in on a Sunday evening. I really appreciate that. So, a little bit about myself. As Arjun mentioned, I am a postdoctoral researcher, a research fellow at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. A lot of my work looks at how environmental changes are impacting biodiversity. Previously, I finished a PhD at Columbia University looking at how climate and habitat loss impacts birds, specifically in the Western Ghats. A bit of that work will be something I'll be talking to you about today. Before that, I actually was an engineer. This was probably 10 years back. And I was an engineer turned ecologist, and I still apply some of those broader engineering thinking to some of the work that I do today. So today's talk will be broadly structured into three components. I realized that it would be great to provide a broader overview to an audience to understand how these big drivers of biodiversity loss, especially climate change and habitat loss, have impacted biodiversity, are impacting biodiversity. And then we'll go over to the second part of the talk. We'll be talking about things that the audience is quite familiar with, which is remediation, restoration, and specifically how we're using a novel tool, which is acoustics, to understand the trajectory of restoration. And lastly, I want to finish by talking about a vision for how we can use conservation bioacoustics to tackle these broader drivers of biodiversity loss. So, for the last decade or so, I have been really thinking about these two big drivers of biodiversity loss, which you're all familiar with. climate change and habitat loss, and how that impacts biodiversity. And this has been the focus of my research for over a decade now. But I have specifically been thinking about these drivers in mountains. And mountains are fascinating to me because, as we all know, if you go up a mountain range, climatically, you're bound to experience sharp decreases in temperature and vast variation in other climatic variables simply by just climbing, say, 100 or 200 meters up a mountain range. Right? At the same time, as you can see in this particular image, you're probably going to encounter a variety of different habitat types that go from, say, dry forests to wet forests to high elevation grasslands, as you can see here. But what's also fascinating to me is that in the tropics alone, we have over 70% of the world's bird diversity. They're incredibly biodiverse. And this is something you're all familiar with, especially in India. And it's just amazing that tropical mountains have over 70% of the world's bird diversity in less than 10% of the global terrestrial area. And today I'll be telling you a few stories from a mountain range that's familiar to you. This is the Western Ghats. I am from Bangalore, and I was very fortunate to grow up close to the Western Ghats. As we all know, this is a mountain range that spans the entire southwestern coast of India and is home to an extraordinary diversity of wildlife. Specifically, I'll be telling you a few stories from the southern Western Ghats, which is the Nilgiri Hills and the Anamalai Hills. But before I move any further, something I wanted to emphasize in this talk is that these landscapes, like many other biodiverse parts of India, are shared landscapes. Humans literally share their backyards with wildlife here, from charismatic megafauna like elephants and leopards to other fauna and smaller critters like insects. So if you ever came to the Western Ghats, this is a site that you'll probably see in the Anamalai Hills. You'll probably see undisturbed forests and these ancient forests in the background, but you'll also see other human modified land cover types like tea plantations, which are actually critical to support the livelihoods of thousands of people who live here. So it's often a mosaic of different landscapes that you see in the Anamalai Hills or in different parts of the Western Ghats. And for the better part of the last 5 years, I've been fascinated by bird diversity here. So I've been primarily looking at birds, using birds as this model to understand how climate change and habitat loss are impacting biodiversity. So for the first part of my talk, I'll first tell you about what we know so far, which is how does climate change and landscape change impact bird communities? And for this particular talk, I'll be going to the Nilgiri Hills and telling you a bit about what we have learned so far. So to answer this particular question, for the last couple of years, we have primarily been using a lot of historical data. And the reasoning here is that we need to better understand how historical data or historical environments and changes have shaped the biodiversity we see today to better understand what we can do in the near future. And given our colonial past, it's insane that we have a treasure trove of historical data, especially ecological data sets, maps. We have records of bird specimens, records of other museum specimens, hunting records, etc. So when I first started asking this question, I started thinking about, is there even enough historical data to answer this question? And I realized that we actually have a lot of historical data. For example, we have detailed maps that go back to the 1850s and 60s that describe distinct habitat types. We knew where the grasslands were, we knew where the forests were. We also have climate data that goes to as far back as the 1870s, data from the Indian Meteorological Department. So on your right here, you see a map, a schematic of the Anamalai Hills and the Nilgiri Hills. But what I wanted to point out here are these black dots that you see here are essentially weather stations that go back to the 1850s and 60s. So we have been amassing this data set for over 150 years now. And of course, we have detailed historical information on birds and other taxonomic groups, simply because initially people were just fascinated by the biodiversity that occurred here. For example, an early ornithologist by the name of William Davison, in fact, carried out detailed surveys across the Nilgiri Hills. So this is a map that he drew, Uh, and he actually went across different parts of the Nilgiri Hills and then extended further west to parts of Wayanad. And he carried out surveys of bird specimens from the 1880s. And some of this information is actually lying around at museums across the world, specifically museums like the Natural History Museum in Tring in the UK. And this is amazing because if you see the image on the right, all these birds come with this tag, this museum tag that we associate these birds with. And on this particular tag, ornithologists used to write information on the scientific name, when they collected it, where they collected it from, which gives us a better understanding of where these birds used to occur in the past. So what I first did when I started doing some exploration into historical data was we first decided that we need to get a better understanding of how the landscape and climate has changed over time to then ask how those changes have impacted biodiversity. So we first started looking at this old historical map from the Nilgiris. This is actually a map that we stitched together. There's another longer story that I can go into towards the end of the talk, but it's taken us over 3 to 4 years to actually stitch together different tiles of the map. We had to go to different places to get different aspects of the map. So this is basically a map from 1848 of the Nilgiri Hills. And just to show you the scale of this map, in fact, it's a map that was actually produced on cloth and linen, and it occupied the better part of an entire room, almost like 6 feet by 10 feet. And what was fascinating about some of these old maps is that if you look closely, you can actually see that these different colors depict different habitat types. Brown implies that it's agriculture, dark green implies that it's forest, while light green implies that it's grasslands. And thanks to the efforts of a student, Amrita Rajan, she actually manually digitized every single polygon on this map. So she basically went ahead and drew polygons and circles on each of these different colors, which I'm calling different land cover types or habitat types. And we were able to better understand what the landscape looked like in 1848. And so this is one of the first studies which is actually giving us a better sense of the quantitative nature of what the landscape was almost 150 years back. So I'm going to walk you through this a bit. This is a version that Amrita produced. This is a map that I just showed you previously, except we have now assigned different habitat types to this particular map. So you can see that there are distinct land cover classes here. The yellow essentially represents grasslands, and the green are forests. But you also see quite a bit of agriculture, right? And then what we did was we started using historical maps and satellite imageries to provide a time series going from 1848 to 2018. And when I started analyzing the satellite image for 2018, this is what the landscape looks like today. I'll be going back and forth to emphasize this a bit, but you can clearly see that a landscape that was primarily grasslands and forests currently ends up looking like a landscape that is largely plantations. And of course, there is quite a bit of historical information and stories to tell us how this has occurred. But we now have a better understanding of what areas were converted from grasslands to plantations, or forests to plantations, or settlements, and vice versa. 1848 and 2018, right? And essentially, what we're finding is that there's been almost an 80% decrease in grassland habitats over the last 150 years, and over a 300% increase in plantations of exotic species, specifically things like acacia, pine, eucalyptus, and of course, other cash crops like tea, which was very important when the British initially first started cultivating it in the early 1870s when coffee failed in the Nilgiris. Uh, so we now have a sort of like a brief understanding of how the landscape changed over time. We then started looking at climate, and when we started looking at mean monthly temperatures, what we found was that over the last 150 years, there's been almost a 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius increase across elevations. So these different colors represent different elevations going from low elevations to high elevations. But what is truly concerning from this graph is that irrespective of elevation, we have already hit the limit of over 1 to 1.2 Celsius increase in mean monthly temperatures. And so Putting all of this together, we now wanted to ask, how has this century or over a century of environmental change impacted bird communities in the Nilgiri Hills? And remember, I was telling you about some of these bird specimens earlier, right? And so what we did was we went back to the exact same sites after a period of 150 years where these birds were found. And we wanted to ask if birds like the vulnerable slash endangered Nilgiri pipit is still found in some of these locations. And this is a graph that I'll walk you through. So this is a graph of basically what I'm calling a relative abundance for two time periods, the historical time period, which is pre-1900, and the modern time period, which is essentially 2021. What I want you to focus on in this graph are simply the red bars, um, and the red bars essentially represent what the abundance was historically, while the blue bars tell you what I'm sorry, I got it the other way around. The blue bars essentially represent what the abundance was historically, while the red bars essentially tell you what the abundance is today. And so you can see that grassland bird species have declined in abundance precipitously. So if I look at two species here, like the Malabar lark and the Nilgiri pipit, which are largely grassland birds, their relative abundance is gone down almost precipitously. And these are birds that are currently listed as vulnerable and least concern. And the results that we're finding here, in fact, have been reflected in the recent State of India's Birds report as well, where they're finding that grassland birds actually have undergone drastic declines uh, since 2000s. So now what we've found so far is that 80% of grassland area in the Nilgiris has been lost in the last 150 years. Temperatures have increased by over 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But what we're also finding is that biodiversity, especially birds as a model, are responding negatively largely. Specifically, grassland specialist birds have declined dramatically over time. Excuse me. And this is fairly concerning, right? So now the next question is, where do we go from here? So what do we do given that we have this information of how biodiversity has responded to these environmental changes? And naturally, one of the key solutions is habitat recovery. And I don't need to profess this to an audience who knows a lot about this, but uh, I wanted to quickly touch upon the fact that we are all aware of the Bond Challenge, which is a challenge to essentially ask all countries to meet a lofty goal of restoring over 350 million hectares of degraded land by 2030. Many countries are on their way to meet the target. And of course, we have government institutions and other civil society in helping to achieve some of these goals. But essentially, if the past data is showing us that grassland birds especially, are declining over time, one of the immediate needs is for us to think about how we're restoring some of these habitat types, whether it's grasslands or forests. So I'm going to tell you a separate story now from the Anamalai Hills about habitat recovery. I'm not going to talk much about specifically the way habitat recovery is being carried out or the way restoration is being done. But now I'm going to tell you a different story of about how we can monitor what this restoration is doing to biodiversity. So let's go to the southern Western Ghats, especially the Anamalai Hills. This is generally an image of what the landscape looks like. It's a mosaic of largely tea plantations and forest fragments. And one of the first things that I wanted to know was how how has restoration impacted biodiversity? And for the last 20 years, Nature Conservation Foundation has been carrying out active ecological restoration in the Anamalai Hills, especially in the Valparai Plateau. So here's an image taken in 2007 of a degraded forest fragment. But here's an image taken of the exact same forest fragment in 2021. So you can see that floristically, some of these fragments are recovering. And some of the data also shows that habitat structure has recovered. But the next question was, what about fauna? Are fauna coming back to these actively restored fragments? To answer this question, again, I went to look at birds as an indicator. And I realized that if I wanted to ask whether birds are returning to these fragments, I could carry out a detailed study, which has been done in the past by Priyanka Hariharan and Shankar Raman, work that was recently published, where they carried out detailed manual surveys across each of these habitat types to ask if birds are responding positively or negatively to restoration. But I also realized that over 70% of tropical birds are often detected by ear. We're often seeing these birds, we're often hearing these birds before we are even seeing them. So I started thinking about how we can use this slightly novel tool, which is bioacoustics, to monitor habitat recovery. And one of the big advantages of bioacoustics is that we can not only get at specific taxa like birds, but we can also look at other vocalizing groups, whether it's mammals, whether it's insects, or herpetofauna, which also form a crucial aspect of the biodiversity in any given place. And often, when we are carrying out studies to understand how biodiversity responds to any particular intervention or remediation, we often don't have the manpower or the resources to actually carry out detailed studies on every taxonomic groups. And I believe that bioacoustic tries to fill that particular gap. And these days we are using acoustics with integration of artificial intelligence to essentially carry out automated detection of different species. We are also able to detect quote unquote illegal events, or rather unusual events, specifically poaching and other aspects, work being done in other parts of the tropics, especially in Africa. So I wanted to use audio recorders in Valparaiso Plateau across different habitat types to ask the very same question: are how is fauna responding to active restoration? So to quickly tell you a bit more about the Valparaiso Plateau, it's fascinating because we have this natural experiment of sorts. We have this gradient of forest regeneration in this particular area. We have undisturbed benchmark forests because the plateau is essentially surrounded by the Anamalai Tiger Reserve. We also have forest fragments that have been identified that are being actively restored. At the same time, researchers have chosen fragments that are comparable to these actively restored fragments. But in these fragments, only natural regeneration is going on. In other words, there is no intervention being done. And the goal here is to understand how an intervention like restoration is impacting biodiversity. And the hypothesis here is that active restoration would do way better than natural regeneration, but it will probably take way longer for these restored fragments to reach the levels of biodiversity that these undisturbed primary forests have. So what we did was we ended up taking these small, tiny audio recorders, and we deployed them across 43 sites along this gradient that I'm talking about. And we had almost 2 weeks of recording at each site. Fun fact is that we started the study especially during COVID, and then there was the lockdowns. So I had to leave these recorders in the field for more than 2 weeks or 3 weeks at a stretch. And at that point, I didn't realize it, but now I realize that there are better ways to enclose these recorders. At that point, we were leaving these recorders in Ziploc covers, and when I came back, when we had like a brief, opening post lockdown, I realized that rodents and other giant squirrels had bitten into the bag, and water was collected, or the recorder had fallen down, etc. But I guess these are all lessons that you learn in hindsight once you start using some of these devices. But yeah, essentially, we had over 5,000 plus hours of data, and that's another thing I wanted to touch upon. Definitely think through specifically how you want to be sampling using audio recorders. The question is critical to ask, and very important to design, because you don't want to collect unnecessary levels of information, because you need to also think about data storage, data management, and other things. But I'm happy to talk more about this towards the end of this presentation. So what we did with this data was, well, Akshay, a research assistant who was working with me, manually annotated over 70 hours of data to especially ask are birds calling between 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. So we would take 4 hours of data from um, each site, and we would split it into different clips, and then we would listen to each of them manually. So this took a lot of time, because we don't yet have like this massive training library that you can just throw into one of these artificial intelligence models to just give us what birds are calling. But a bit more on that in a couple of slides. So Akshay essentially manually annotated all the birds that were calling in each of these recordings. And what we did find is there is a graph that shows the proportion of rainforest species. When I say rainforest species specialists, these are birds like the great hornbill or the Malabar trogon. We wanted to ask uh, how often are they being detected across benchmark sites, actively restored sites, and naturally regenerating sites. So AR refers to active restoration, NR natural regeneration, and BM benchmark sites. And what is really encouraging about this particular result that you can see is that the proportion of rainforest species detected in actively restored sites falls bang in between naturally regenerating sites and benchmark sites, which are your primary forests. So, which shows that active restoration has a positive impact on bird diversity. But of course, it's probably going to take much longer for the levels of bird diversity to reach what it was one day in some of these primary, what it is one day in some of these primary forests. But one of the other advantages of using audio recorders is we can actually, sorry, before I talk about other vocalizing fauna, I felt that it was important to talk to all of you about what what the soundscape or what the birds that are calling sound like in each of these different habitat types. So this is what a naturally regenerating fragment looks like and sounds like. So you're probably hearing a couple of bird calls here and there, feeble bird calls, but largely some of these birds that we're hearing are uh, open country birds or birds that like to often take up edge habitats, etc. And birds like the tailor bird, rufous babblers, and chestnut headbeater. So when we go to some of these actively restored fragments, this is what it sounds like. So you can hear some of these cacophonous sounds that the racket-tailed drongo makes, but you also see that the canopy starts closing in as some of these pioneer species start to take over the canopy. Right? But of course, when you go to a benchmark forest, this is what it sounds like, and these are some of the birds that you hear and see. So, yeah, anyway, I just wanted to give you all a glimpse of what the bird diversity and the broader soundscape is like across each of these fragments. But remember, I had mentioned that one of the advantages of using acoustics is that we can actually move beyond just looking at birds. We can actually start thinking about other vocalizing fauna. And one way to think about this is a measure that we call the acoustic space use. In other words, when we think of sounds, we often think of something, we often think of frequency, right? We often think of different frequencies from low frequency to high frequency, as you can see on the left side of this particular slide. But what we can actually look at is we can actually visualize sound and we can visualize how sound is over time. So in other words, we can actually ask what the broader soundscape is like when we go from midnight to dawn, dawn to dusk, and then dusk again back to midnight. And this is a measure that we call acoustic space use, or in other words, it's the amount of sounds that are being produced or that are being heard in each of these different frequency bins or spaces. So to emphasize this a bit more, this is what the soundscape looks like, or the acoustic space use looks like for low frequencies, for 0 to 10,000 hertz. And for people who often work with birds, you'll see this bright red spot around dawn, which is the infamous, the dawn chorus. The birds are often most active at dawn, and that's of course captured by these soundscapes. So what this graph is telling us is that there's maximum amount of sounds around dawn between 0 to say 3000 hertz in frequency. This gives us a better understanding of what acoustic spaces are being occupied and how much of that acoustic space is being occupied. But moving beyond birds, we can actually see these higher frequencies which humans can't hear. We can't hear above some of these higher frequencies, but these higher frequencies are often associated with insect activity. And many of these insects that are often active nocturnally, you can see red blobs between midnight and dawn, and again dusk back again to midnight, right? Or rather until morning, but largely at higher frequencies. So what we did was we took these measures of acoustic space use and we wanted to ask, how does the acoustic space use vary across this gradient of forest regeneration? And so this is a representative graph of what it is like, or what the acoustic space use is like for a naturally regenerating site, an actively restored site, and a benchmark forest. So the first thing that you might see in this graph is that the benchmark forest is lit with acoustic activity. There's just so much going on there across different frequencies, across different times of the day. But when we started pouring into some of this data, what we noticed was that the higher frequencies are largely empty in both naturally regenerating sites and actively restored sites, giving us an inclination that insect vocalizations, or as we would like to call it, insects which largely vocalize, are absent from these restored and unrestored sites. This was really perplexing to us, but this in fact tells us that there is an advantage of using acoustics to look beyond birds, to look at other taxonomic groups. Clearly, there's something going on here in terms of perhaps how insects are fairly sensitive to changes in microclimate, and maybe we need more data to look at how insects are responding to restoration. So to broadly summarize what we found in this second part of the talk using bioacoustics, and especially in thinking about habitat recovery in the Annamalai Hills, is that rainforest birds encouragingly are returning to these actively restored sites. However, when we look at other taxonomic groups, we find that sounds at higher frequencies are largely missing from actively restored and naturally regenerating sites, a result that we want to explore further to better understand why this might be the case. And lastly, again, as I mentioned briefly, I think bioacoustics is a tool that can be utilized to monitor multiple taxonomic groups. And now I want to move towards the latter part or the last part of my talk to make a case for how we can use this to tackle these broad drivers of biodiversity loss. But before I do, I want to briefly talk about some of these next steps. I know I threw in these words AI, etc., but I wanted to mention that there's been some concrete work happening in this particular realm. So the Bird Clay, as they call it, the Bird Clay 2024 challenge, it's essentially a hacking competition where we supply hours and hours of bird calls from the Western Ghats, and hackers and computer scientists essentially develop this model that can help us automate identification of bird calls. So this is being done in collaboration with the lab at Cornell, BirdNet, along with scientists at ISO Tirupati. But the goal here is that once we have a model developed by scientists at Google, along with the hackers who take part in this competition, the idea here is to use acoustics to monitor the trajectory of restoration across different sites. So we would like to implement this across the different ERA sites across India to help get a better understanding of the trajectory of faunal recovery across some of these restored sites. And lastly, something that I wanted to mention is that I'm very passionate about communicating the science that we do to a broader audience, so that we're all engaged in this endeavor of trying to preserve and protect ecosystem health and human well-being. So the graphics that I showed you, that was made by Chayant Gonzalez. We even made a video that's currently publicly available on YouTube. You can scan it through the QR code. But if you ever visit the Annamalai Hills, please do visit the Nature Information Center. You can, of course, see the video there. So with this, I hope I have kind of convinced you, or at least made you think about how acoustics can be used as this novel tool or technology to tackle these big drivers of biodiversity loss, which are climate change and habitat loss. And now I want to switch gears to talk very briefly about a vision for what acoustics or utility of conservation bioacoustics in India might look like. The idea here is that we want to continue relying on conservation technology, but we want to use it for fundamental as well as broad applications to essentially work towards the goal of ecosystem integrity and human well-being. So one of the things that we would like to, or three of the things that we would like to continue working on are research, engagement, and training and capacity building. And some of the work that we've already been doing in terms of research and teaching is, working with nonprofit organizations like Keystone Foundation and Nature Conservation Foundation, along with academic institutions like IISER Tirupati, to continue doing both fundamental as well as applied ecological research. At the same time, the goal is to continue further engaging with other stakeholders, because I think this is really critical for us to work towards this holistic goal of biodiversity conservation. Engaging with the forest department and other government institutions, but also we have to engage with an audience that's also far removed from some of these locations at times. Right? So this was an exhibition that occurred in Bangalore a few years back, and through this exhibition, we actually be able to engage like a wide audience who were going through like a central part of Bangalore, right? Learning a bit more about why birds sing, and they of course heard a few bird calls from the Western Ghats, which was great, but also just broadly learn about bird vocalizations or bioacoustics or behavior, etc. And lastly, we've also been working largely with students and essentially running workshops and symposia. This was a workshop that was recently conducted at the ATBC conference that happened in Coimbatore earlier last year. We had a workshop on the use of this software called Raven and an intro to how you analyze sound that was conducted in collaboration with students and researchers at IISER Tirupati. But we also organized a symposium where researchers from across the tropics presented the current work that they're doing in the realm of bioacoustics. So I think working towards all of these three goals will really help us expose a larger audience, but also work in a collaborative manner to think a bit more about how conservation technology can be utilized for biodiversity conservation. So with that, I wanted to broadly conclude by summarizing my talk. We initially spoke about these big drivers of biodiversity loss, climate change, and habitat loss. I told you a small story about how climate change and habitat loss have already impacted bird diversity in the Nilgiri Hills over the last 150 years, specifically grassland birds, which have been severely negatively impacted. But I told you about also about habitat recovery, and I spoke to you about how conservation technology, specifically bioacoustics, can be used to monitor the trajectory of ecological restoration. And lastly, I spoke to you about a vision for conservation bioacoustics in India. With that, I'd like to thank you all for coming and tuning into this talk, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Vijay, and thank you so much for this talk. I think, yeah, we can open it up to the audience for questions. Mandeep, do you want to take it and see from the starting if there are questions that we can start off with?
Yep. Vijay, we do have some questions, and I guess we can go in the chronological order. So Karthik had a question which was about starting bioacoustics analysis. He's asking, how do I start a bioacoustics analysis in a new landscape? I am in Kanha National Park and have been recording bird songs and calls. Do I start by collecting historical data and compare data, or are there any other aspects that can be explored?
Yeah, no, I would say that it really depends on what is it the question that you're trying to ask here. Do you want to understand, how bird songs vary across the national park or across different habitat types? In that context, I would, yeah, first think about some of these questions and then start to think about how you might go about in collecting data, whatever acoustic data you're collecting. I would highly also recommend some amazing work coming from Kanha, especially work done by Pooja Choksi. She's been doing acoustic work in the context of ecological restoration across central India.
All right. Doris was asking how much does the absence of insects in AR and NR sites impact the abundance of birds? Is there any difference according to bird functional types?
Okay, I think I saw the first question. So I'm just going to tackle the one about chemicals and tea plantations. I I think I would say that the question relating to absence of insects, that's a great question. We don't know if that might be the case. We do see that there is use of quite a bit of use of insecticides and others in the tea plantations, but we still don't know enough about how that impacts insect diversity there. That's something we hope to study. Yeah. How much of the absence of insects are impacting abundance? That's a great question. I mean, there is currently work being done by a PhD student, Priyanka Hariharan, and her research assistants Swati and Pravina. They're looking at largely insectivorous birds and how they vary across different habitat types. But I think some of that research will give us a better understanding of, by proxy, give us a better understanding of where insectivorous birds are present or not. But I think we need to start doing detailed bioacoustic work on insects specifically, especially collecting, no, I shouldn't say collecting rather, especially collecting calls on different insects and trying to tag them at least to the level of genera or family or things of that sort.
Sorry,
We'll
just
hope that.
interrupting. I think Akshay had a similar question on the lines of how do you distinguish insect species? So his question was, how much harder is it to distinguish insect species from each other, similar to how you've done for birds, or what is the status of that? And what are your thoughts on that?
I would say I think it's way harder to do it for insects, simply because of the sheer diversity. At least that's my naive understanding. But there is some fascinating work being done by the lab of Dr. Rohini Balakrishnan at CES in ISC, and also Dr. Manjri Jain had done some amazing work for her PhD looking at insects. I think that honestly, for insects in the Western Ghats, we are still in that information collection phase. We still need to know more about what families and what genera are present, and we still need a lot of acoustic data before we can start to even begin to see how these acoustic signatures are varying.
Right. Okay. Moving on to questions about bats. Nandini was asking how. Just a sec. Yeah. Did your night data exclude bat calls? How did you know it was only insects?
Yeah. So I would say, for the most part, the frequencies that we were looking at was between 0 to 24,000 hertz. So I'm sure there were a few bat species, but for the large part, I think I would say it was insect species, simply because we were, uh, by default of the way we collected data, we excluded majority of the bat species.
Okay. I think Samir had a bunch of logistical questions. He's asking if there are more maps available, like the historical map that you showed us, and also what kind of devices were used to make these recordings.
Yeah, the maps question first. There are plenty of such maps available, uh, especially some of these older Survey of India maps. I think it might take a bit of time to get some of this data, but it truly is worth it. There is plenty of Survey of India maps dating to the early 1910s, etc. I am not aware of any such highly detailed map like the one I showed from 1848 for other parts of India. Um, I believe this is probably one of those first maps that was done when the Great Trigonometrical Survey of India began, and when they were surveying across South India. But there are multiple online sources now where you can get some of these maps, like the Rumsey Map Collection, and you can of course write to curators in other libraries across the world and tell them that you're working on this, and they'll be more than happy to share some of these maps.
All right. Pradeep's asking if you got any important information about bird behavior and cognitive behavior during your studies.
That's tricky to do still using acoustics. I think we can get at behavior in the context of vocalizations and calling, but the way majority of behavioral ecological studies are done, they're still largely handheld recorders. We go out there to the field, we know which bird is exactly calling, which individual is calling, so we have a better sense of uh, which which individual is making some of those vocalizations, and then we can compare it to other individuals. I would definitely, refer you to some really cool work being done by Chitti Arvind at ISA Tirupati, who's specifically looking at bird vocalization differences across landscapes.
Question about insects again. Akshay is asking how harder is it to distinguish insect species from each other, similar to how you've done for birds?
I think we just did that question. We can go maybe to the next one, unless Vijay, is there something more you'd like to add on to that?
No, I think you covered it, Arjun. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more about it towards the end after some of these questions. Yeah.
All right. Moving on to the next one. Abhijit's asking how practical is it to use bioacoustic surveys in current biodiversity assessments like EIA as well as ESIAs? As in the current methods, the surveys are totally based on visual encounters and limited calls that can be identified.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think so. Some of the work that I showed you was we did go into specifically identifying different bird species and trying to figure out what birds are really calling and all of that stuff. But there has been quite a few advancements in terms of coming up with these indexes or these indices of or these proxies of all the biodiversity that are calling in a particular location. So they call it acoustic indexes, which are often like a mathematical formulation or some sort of an equation that's applied across a soundscape. And so we have a broad sense of, okay, if the soundscape has this much level of acoustic space, that could potentially imply that there is higher levels of biodiversity there. So we are seeing some literature, this is still fairly early, some literature showing that acoustic indices have a positive association with biodiversity. Some are in fact not showing any association at all. So I feel like more research needs to be done. But I would argue that something is better than nothing at this stage, especially if you want to conduct assessments. So especially if you want to do, rapid biodiversity assessments at this moment. Yeah.
Okay. I think we have two related questions about habitat structure and diversity of trees. So Gauri's question is about patterns that you saw maybe with respect to the habitat structure, density of trees, presence of understory, etc. in terms of quality of acoustic recordings. And related question from Vikas Pal is any type of tree plantation favorable for increasing avifauna diversity, or do we need to keep in mind the choice of species to be planted?
Yeah, I'll take the first question. Like in terms of habitat structure, so work done by Priyanka Hariharan and Shankar Raman that was published in Biological Conservation, they in fact showed significant association with habitat structure and some variables of habitat structure and bird presence absence. But in terms of acoustic recordings, interestingly, we did not see a high correlation between habitat structure and acoustic space use the way we calculated it. But given that there is a very high correlation between structure and bird presence absence, we we could move on to then thinking about how bird presence or absence can be extracted from these acoustic space use graphs. Yeah. Sorry, I missed the second question.
The second question was about whether tree plantations are favorable for increasing avifauna diversity, or do we need to keep in mind the choice of species to be planted?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I really think that there are other restoration practitioners who are probably better favored to answer this question. But in my understanding, I think it's truly important to plant the right species in the right location along at the right time to first show an increase in flora before trying to think about how it might impact avifauna. But some of these, I think what's important is for us to better understand what some of these landscapes were like. So, if this was a degraded forest fragment of a particular forest type, then we would know that we would have to plant some of those specific forest species. Yeah, I'll stop there.
All right. There's an interesting question about noise pollution. Nanda's asking whether it's possible to conduct these bioacoustic studies in urban areas where we have a higher incidence of noise pollution.
Yeah, no, I think there's been some really amazing work done looking at levels of noise pollution and how it impacts biodiversity. One study that I can really think of, which I think everyone should definitely look at, was scientists in California wanted to look at how the COVID lockdowns were impacting bird species. They were specifically looking at sparrows, and they found that sparrows started singing at different frequencies, but they were also singing differently just post lockdown compared to before lockdown. So yes, there have been studies looking at showing that there are associations between noise pollution and the way species call or vocalize or sing. But I think we need to do more studies in India.
Yeah. But yeah, there's, by the way, feedback for the QR code. Nandini says she tried scanning. I also tried scanning the QR code, and
Okay,
it led to, I think it says it's been suspended.
got it.
So,
Okay, thanks.
yeah, maybe you can share it with us post the call.
Sure.
We have time for, yeah, we do have time for more questions. So Samir's asking, were you able to document seasonal variations in bioacoustics in the region? Across what time duration was your study? Sorry if I missed this.
Yeah, no, that's actually a key question of one of our ongoing projects at the moment. We're actually looking at how there is variation when we go from quote unquote winter to summer. But we are also actually asking if there is, in fact, variation within a single day. Is there diurnal variation when we look from, say, dawn to dusk? Are there, because we know that there are different communities that sing at dawn and dusk, but how does the acoustic space use vary? And how does this vary across seasons? Yeah, we hope to have a better answer in the coming months.
Pradeep, you
Pradeep,
also had sorry. Mandeep,
no, go
please go
on,
ahead.
Arjun.
Pradeep, you also had a question about seasonality. Do you want to ask it directly?
Pradeep, are you on the call? Pradeep, you're on mute if you're speaking. Okay. For now, we'll move on to Mahashweta Lashkar's question, which is for a restored area, the activity. Is this a question? Just a second. Yeah, for a restored area, the activity was low with regards to the benchmark. Do you think it varies for restored sites, or is it more dependent on the topography?
So, when some of these sites were initially chosen for restoration, one thing actually before I say that, I would say that largely the Valparai Plateau, the elevation is between 1000 meters to 1300 meters, 1100 meters to 1300 meters. So, they're largely very comparable in elevation, topography, and in terms of some of these habitat types, the forest type that occurs there. But to answer your specific question, it did vary across restored sites. So we see that the activity is low across restored sites when compared to benchmark sites. It was not like a single site or another. But for the sake of this talk, I wanted to show you a representative figure of what it was like.
Okay. Question about bats again. With respect to bat detectors in India, do we have any devices which can detect bat species on field directly upon recording their calls? Question by Abhijit.
I remember a while ago that Rohit Chakravarti had spoken about some of these bat detectors. So Rohit Chakravarti does a lot of work on bats in India. I think he might be a good person to ask this question. But there are bat detectors now that can give you a cursory information on what species are being detected, sometimes in real time. Yeah.
Nandini is asking, how does your call data correlate with bird density data at the site?
Yeah, so Yeah, no, sorry, I was thinking a bit about this because one of the things we've been currently trying to do is compare an earlier study that was done by Priyanka Hariharan, which was done using manual surveys, like manual point count. She went there, collected the data herself, and we have a specific sense of how many birds were there because we got visual information. So we got that bird density aspect. Uh, and then we took my data, and this is currently ongoing. I've made some of these analysis public, but it is work in progress. What we're finding is that this is highly variable depending on the bird species. We're seeing a very high R square for some birds, like red-whiskered bulbuls, racket-tailed drongos. But for birds where you would expect a high correlation between density and calls, we don't see that. Like I thought going in that we'd see a high correlation for white-cheeked barbets, but that's not necessarily the case. So I am still thinking, I mean, we are still thinking about different ways to analyze this data, but at the community level, we are seeing very high correlations, or rather causations, I should say. We are seeing very high R square values between bird density uh, as collected through point counts and call data as collected through detections. Yeah.
Okay, I think it's mostly thank you messages now, and I mean messages about how wonderful this talk was. I think Samir was asking for links to articles in the field of study that they can refer to. More links. So I think that's something we can share after the call, Samir and everyone else. I think we have covered all of the questions. So
Thanks, Vijay. Thanks, Mandeep, for taking all these questions. Thank you, Vijay, so much for this talk. It's been wonderful. It's been really nice to have you here. And definitely, I think a lot of people who were there from who have restoration projects listed, a lot of them were also attending the talks. I'm sure we can try and figure out what would be the next steps, as you pointed out, that how
Yeah.
ERA could also work together. So thank you so much for this. And thank you, everyone, for joining in for this talk by Vijay on sounds of restoration.
Thanks, Arjun. Thanks, Mandeep.
Thank you very much.